you talk about in the book how something changes, where previously Israel's activities were largely conducted at the level of the state, and it was engaging with other states, and it was largely articulated as these modernization projects to build states. And then from the 1990s into the 2000s, we see more private actors like security agencies and companies playing a dominant role in how Israel's diplomacy plays out. So, and you describe it as it resulting in a kind of clandestine diplomacy. So could you unpack that for us? Because, I mean, as you point out, it's difficult in this new sort of way of doing things to point out where the state's interests end and where private interests begin. So how did we see the sort of privatization of Israeli foreign policy? How did that kind of play out?
Yeah, I think there's a dynamic here between securitization and privatization. And historically, they kind of bleed into each other. Because it's already in the 60s, you would see that increasingly security actors have more and more power in determining how Israel's relationship with countries in Africa evolve. You see kind of increasingly the Mossad doing things behind the back of other actors, this defense ministry doing things, selling arms, initiating cooperations between the back of other actors. And I mean, I think the clear example is Israel's support to South Sudanese rebels in the 60s. And it's a clear example because in the early 60s, the rebels came and said they want support, and Israel said, no, that's not something we are interested in. But by the late 60s, where it became more important for Israel, the Mossad took over and just provided this support. But then after most countries cut ties with Israel, obviously there is no, the diplomatic relations kind of either disappear or operate in a very quiet manner. But many of the private actors that were already operating in Africa can stay and continue to do business in the continent. And many of the, different security corporations, wherever they exist, and they're not necessarily that strong in many countries, can continue as well. So places like Kenya, Ethiopia, security actors could have, quite close relationships with governments that openly resisted or said they have no relations with Israel. So there's this kind of intelligence security relationships that exist beneath the surface. But what you also have is increasingly actors that were part of some kind of an Israeli formal presence in Africa, either diplomatic or security, that once they finish their job, stay around to be kind of private contractors, advisors of all sorts, intermediaries. And you see that in many countries, increasingly throughout the 80s and 90s. And whenever Israel kind of tries to rebuild its relationship with African countries, these are the networks that are already there for it to do that. Rather than build again kind of an institutionalized state-to-state relationship, you build on these kind of privatized, various different networks that look quite differently in different countries, but what they have in common is that they are extremely informal, often have to do with different industries, security industries, mining, things like that. And that is something that we see shaping Israel's presence in Africa until today.
But at the same time, and I have one more question before we bring the other guests on. At the same time, with Netanyahu, there's also been like an increase in these kind of state-to-state, right? He's gone on these diplomatic trips, and I think in the book you read about, you opened the book with the inauguration of Uhuru Kenyatta after the disputed election, and he goes on to Guinea, Senegal, etc. But the question before we go to the next session, and hopefully you'll stick around, is this question about it's not a one-way kind of story. At some level, there's also Africans who get something out of their relationship with Israel. Like they're also active agents in this relationship, right? And I think you mentioned in the book, I think at least a different sets of actors like evangelical movements, Pentecostalist movements, and then they have their own ideology of how they think the world works and how the world will end, how conflict will be resolved. And at the same time, the Israeli government gets something out of them. You mentioned in the book also like different African leaders who use Israel for their own geostrategic interests where they are, their own needs, whether it will be around military, whether it's technology, industrial, agricultural, etc. And then finally, I think there's the question of Israel. Israel has a migrant crisis, and you have African countries are now solving that, helping Israel solve what Israel might refer to as the infiltrators, the state sort of official rhetoric. Can you just say a little bit about those people like these? And I know it's a big answer with stress for time.
You mentioned quite a lot of things.
We cannot pretend like this is a one-way relationship. There are Africans here with their own interests, and they went into a relationship with Israel too.
Yeah. First, but though you mentioned the kind of more state-to-state dynamics of the last couple of years, and I think one important thing that we need to take into account is that, yes, Netanyahu is very good in doing PR and doing hasbara and, providing a narrative or kind of consolidating a story about what is going on. Once we look behind the kind of, the rhetoric, I don't think we find a lot of state-to-state interactions and cooperation in the last couple of years. If you look at how much money was Israel willing to put in its so-called return to Africa, you hardly find anything. So it's an attempt to push private actors, business people, businesses, different kind of corporations that are mostly economic, including security cells, into Africa. But you don't really find in Israel's engagement the sort of institutionalized, aid, development, all of these things that you would see in, European countries, or even not state-to-state kind of military cooperation. That's also very limited. So yeah, but then on the other side of these relationships, yes, I mean, there are different kind of vectors that shaped why African countries look at Israel as a potential useful ally. And you mentioned Pentecostalism, which I think is extremely influential at this current phase of Israel-Africa relations because of the increasing influence of Pentecostal movements on politics in so many countries. When we talk about Israel's kind of return to Africa in the last decade, so of course there are the Israeli interests of the Palestinians and Iran and migration issues, but there's also the clear shift and the clear movement of, I think, the kind of Pentecostalization of politics in many countries. And the important thing here is that Pentecostal movements are usually very open to endorsing Zionist theologies, not necessarily because of an end of time scenarios and dispensationalist worldviews, but also because of the emphasis on kind of divine blessing and whoever blesses the idea that whoever blesses Israel and does things for Israel will be blessed.